Welcome to Reproductive Endocrinology. In this video, you'll learn the following concepts. You'll be able to describe the feedback control of the production and secretion of the hormones that are related to the reproductive cycle in both sexes. You'll understand better the principal actions of androgens and also the hypothalamo-anterior pituitary control of spermatogenesis and testosterone secretion. You'll be able to describe the feedback control and hormonal changes of the ovarian cycle. And finally, you'll know the principal physiological actions of estrogen. This video focuses on the endocrine function of gonads. We know that the primary function of reproductive organs is to produce gametes. This occurs in gonads, testicles in males, and ovaries in females. However, we'll center our discussion today on hormones produced by the same organs. We'll talk about testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and inhibin. These gonads produce gametes, as I mentioned before. These are sperm cells in males and ovum in females. We also should make a point that these gonads are under control of both the endocrine system and neural function. The neural function is mostly provided by the autonomic nervous system, and that includes both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. So how are these reproductive hormones regulated or controlled? The next slide is going to show you a general schematic representation of how that happens. But I should probably make a point here and mention that there's a difference between the male and the female reproductive systems when it comes to regulation. In males, we have a typical negative feedback loop that we have a very similar mechanism that we have seen previously with most of the other glands. In female regulation, however, we're going to see a difference in negative or positive feedback loops depending on where in the ovarian cycle we're at. This diagram shows you the general events in both sexes. It all starts with the secretion of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, from the hypothalamus. This hormone will make it to the anterior pituitary gland by passing through the portal system between those two organs or glands. And eventually that will stimulate the release of both FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These hormones, once in the general circulation, will reach the gonads, and they will have two different effects. They will stimulate the development of gametes, so sperm cells and ovum, depending on the sex, and also they will stimulate the release of sex hormones. Sex hormones, in turn, will have target organs of themselves, and these sex hormones are going to be mostly targeting other organs throughout the reproductive system in those sexes. Notice here that this concentration of sex hormones in blood will provide either a negative or positive feedback loop in females, but in males it's always a negative feedback loop. In males, we have two separate compartments. In one compartment, you will have spermatogenesis, or the development of sperm cells, and outside of that compartment, we have the production of androgens or hormones, which is what we're interested in right now. So the one compartment where spermatogenesis occurs is this tubular system. These tubular systems start at the seminiferous tubules. As the name implies, in these tubules we have sperm cells being produced. So on the right side of this slide, we can see here a little bit of what happens at the wall of those tubules. We have two types of cells: germinal cells, which are located here in blue, and the Sertoli cell, which is kind of a sustentacular supporting cell for these primordial cells developing. So from a germinal cell here, we're going to notice here that it's a diploid cell. It has a full set of chromosomes. A primary spermatocyte, also diploid, will develop from it. And then the primary spermatocyte will undergo meiosis 1. This is the reduction phase of meiosis, in which two Secondary spermatocytes that are haploid will be formed. These two cells have half the chromosomes. Secondary spermatocytes undergo a second process called meiosis II, which is very similar to mitosis. As a result, we end up with 4 spermatids. They're all haploid as well. Eventually, these spermatids will become sperm cells or spermatozoa. As these cells develop, they will also grow a long flagellum, and they will be then collected in the tubes or the lumen of the seminiferous tubule system. Now notice here that there's no other diagram for the endocrine portion, but I just wanted to show you here how these tubules look like. And you can imagine that the other cells producing hormones will be adjacent to the tubules. So as a review for testicular function, in the tubular system, we have spermatogenesis, what we just went over, the development and eventual release of sperm cells. And out of the tubules, we have androgen syntheses. We're going to focus on the production of 2 hormones, testosterone and DHT. DHT stands for dihydrotestosterone, and it's a very potent form of the same hormone that is more active in peripheral tissues. The top part of this diagram we already have discussed. It includes the hypothalamus anterior pituitary axis. And what I'd like to do now is to focus on the specific actions of both FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. FSH will target Sertoli cells. These Sertoli cells serve as supporting cells. They're adjacent to primordial or sperm cells as they develop. They stimulate this process of spermatogenesis, which includes the development of these spermatids eventually. Sertoli cells also will release another hormone called inhibin, and as you may have guessed from the name, it has an inhibitory negative feedback loop back to the anterior pituitary gland to block further release of FSH. So now let's focus on the right side, which is actually very similar. LH, released from the anterior pituitary gland, will target Leydig cells in the testicles. These cells are the ones that produce in males most of the testosterone. You may recall also that the adrenal cortex also produces some. Testosterone, in turn, will be released into the bloodstream, and it will target other parts of the reproductive organs in males, but also other organs as well, such as connective tissues. The concentration of testosterone in blood will in turn inhibit, by negative feedback loops, the further release of LH from the anterior pituitary gland, and also, as a longer loop, it will inhibit further release of GnRH from the hypothalamus. The physiological effects of testosterone, as you can see, are quite extensive. Testosterone is responsible for the differentiation of male accessory reproductive organs, including their development and growth. Testosterone is also responsible for the male secondary sex characteristics, such as hair patterns in the body and deepening of the voice. It facilitates the formation of red blood cells. It's quite anabolic in muscle tissue. It decreases HDL, stimulates spermatogenesis. It's also responsible for quite behavioral responses, and a little bit of related to that, some aggression. And we know how testosterone provides negative feedback for its further release from the hypothalamus pituitary axis. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about the female reproductive endocrinology, making a note that you will get a full women's health unit in this course. So we're going to talk about the endocrine, but before we do that, we will review the development of the follicle and the production and release of the gametes in females. We're here at the ovary, and the tissue around all these primordial cells is called stroma. We start at the primordial follicle, which is its most basic or primitive egg cell, and primordial follicles will eventually develop into a primary follicle. Notice the changes there of the follicle cells from being squamous to being a little cuboidal there. The primary follicle will develop in a cavity, and we call that a preantral follicle. And there's multiple ways, there's multiple terminology for these follicles too. The preantral follicle will become an antral follicle. Here you can see the cavity getting larger. And eventually an antral follicle will become pre-ovulatory. This is an increase in size, and as you can see here, there's a thinning of the follicle on one side. Eventually, the egg during ovulation, typically day 14th in a typical 28-day cycle, will be released from the follicle itself out of the ovary. Then there's an involution process for all these follicular cells, and it will develop into something called an early corpus luteum. The early corpus luteum will mature and eventually will remain in the ovary as scar tissue known as corpus albicans. So these are all the stages from the follicular standpoint. However, we will focus the stages of the cycle in terms of hormonal concentration, which you will see on the next slide. I absolutely love this slide. You can see a lot of events and how the events correlate with each other. So let's start by understanding the graph first. Here on the x-axis, you have time, and this time is divided from 0 days to a typical 28-day cycle. From this point forward, this should be the same as this. Now, take a look at what happens here on 0 days. We start the cycle with the first day of menstruation. Now, this first part, the first 2 weeks of the cycle, it's called follicular phase. The reason for that is that during this phase, we have the development of and growth of the follicle itself. You may recall this from the previous slide, where we have a primordial, a primary, an antral, a preantral, an antral, and eventually the release of the follicle as the egg comes out of the ovary. Now, when this egg cell is released, it is usually trapped by the fimbria of the fallopian tubes. Now, let's see what else happens here in the first 2 weeks. We have a steady body temperature, and notice how there's almost an increase of 1 degree in that day 14 of ovulation, from 36 degrees to 37 degrees Celsius. Now, this change in temperature may be explained by what happens at the hormonal level. If you notice here, the line here that's colored blue, it's marking the trajectory, the peak of LH. It is LH, the one responsible for the release of the egg cell during ovulation of day 14. There's also a little bit of a peak of FSH, but it's not as high as LH. Notice also here that progesterone stays very low throughout the follicular phase of the cycle, but estradiol or estrogen is going to be increasing, and its peak is just right before LH peaks. Then at ovulation itself, the concentration of estrogen drops significantly. Let's take a look now at what happens on the second part of the cycle. This is called the luteal phase, and typically for women that are not that don't have regular 28-day cycles, this is the phase that changes the most. During this second part of the cycle, we're going to call it the luteal phase. Also, some references call it the secretory phase. The reason for that is that there is a development of tissue in the uterus, potentially preparing for a new zygote to be implanted here. Notice on top what happens here and how this correlates to the ovarian cycle. In the ovaries, this is what's going on, that involution of the follicle cells as they become corpus luteum and eventually corpus albicans. Notice here that the body temperature kind of keeps a steady temperature up there closer to 37 degrees during this cycle, this part of the cycle. But in terms of hormones, there's going to be a sudden drop of both LH and FSH. And notice here that there's a surge or a peak for these two hormones, especially progesterone. So progesterone is high in concentrations on the second part of the cycle. And estrogen, there's a little bit of a peak to it. And again, it remains a little bit steady during the whole cycle. They both drop again once the cycle ends, as the body and the uterus prepares for the next cycle during menstruation. So now let's take a look at the effects of estrogen and how does it act on tissues. First, in bone, estrogen is going to promote or actually provide protection against osteoporosis. The way it does that is by inhibiting PTH. It also triggers growth of lung bones and the fusion of epiphyseal plates. This is particularly important, obviously, during adolescence. In the liver, it's going to increase the production of plasma proteins. These plasma proteins play a key role in the transportation of certain hormones. It also increases HDL and VLDL, also triglycerides as well. It lowers cholesterol, all of these in the liver. In terms of electrolyte balance, it will stimulate the formation of angiotensinogen and aldosterone. It also enhances sodium in the kidney. In the thyroid, is going to exaggerate the effects of TSH secretion. Estrogen in conjunction with progesterone, they will both have a positive effect of growth, development, and maintenance for different parts of the female reproductive system, such as the oviducts, the uterus, and the vagina. In clinical practice, you will see most likely plenty of female patients that are taking hormonal contraceptives orally. And there's other forms of getting contraceptives besides pills. But you should know the general effects of the hormones packed in these pills. They're usually a combination of both estrogen and progesterone. And a couple of things that they do: they inhibit the release of GnRH. They also are rich in estrogen, which will prevent FSH, and that obviously has an impact on the development of the follicle. And progesterone, the progesterone part of the pill, prevents the peak of LH. And what that does is that it inhibits ovulation, the actual release of egg cells. During class, we will talk about the role of adipose tissue and how estrogen can actually be synthesized and released from these tissues in particular. There's an enzyme that plays a key part in this role, and that enzyme is called aromatase. Also in class, we will focus on male dysfunctions, primarily because you will get all the female dysfunctions in the women's health unit. So we'll mostly talk about prostatitis, which is inflammation of the prostate gland, and also prostate cancer, and how these two may have an impact on pelvic floor strength in males.